I know what you did, David. You didn't help me. You harvested me.
Do you actually think I owe you any loyalty, James? This isn't a partnership. It's a cap table, and you've been wiped out.
The IPO bell rang at 9:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. James's company was valued at $4.7 billion. That morning, he would discover he owned 11% of it, not 49%, not 25%, 11. The math didn't add up, and yet it was all documented in legal agreements he had signed. The question James needed answered was simple. How do you build something worth billions and end up owning almost nothing? But to answer that question, we have to go back 3 years earlier, to an apartment in Oakland, to the moment when James was alone, and that changed everything. James started coding in a studio apartment in Oakland. In a spare bedroom of a shared lease, he split 3 ways. His portion of the rent was $480 a month. He worked nights at a logistics warehouse, 7 hours from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., so that during the day he could write code. He'd return to the apartment with his hands aching from scanning packages and moving inventory, shower in the dark so he wouldn't wake his roommates, and then spend 12 hours writing infrastructure code. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was building a solution to a problem he lived inside every shift at the warehouse. The product was an API infrastructure layer for e-commerce platforms, not a social network, not a viral game, not the kind of technology that made headlines. It was unsexy infrastructure that solved one specific, expensive problem: latency in real-time inventory updates. Large retailers lose millions when their inventory systems move too slow, when customers order products that are already sold, when warehouses can't communicate with online storefronts at the speed information actually travels. James had discovered this problem because he worked in logistics. He understood the cost intimately. He knew what it meant when the system was slow, and he knew what it was worth to make it fast. For 8 months, nobody cared about his solution. He couldn't convince a single enterprise customer to switch to his API. He had no sales experience. He had no network. He had an idea and the ability to code it, and that wasn't enough to move a business. Then one morning in month 9, a CTO at a mid-size e-commerce company named Veridata decided to test his API as a pilot. Just a test. No contract, no payment, just a trial running in production. He was using James's infrastructure, and the company didn't know it yet that they were examining James's work, examining what he'd spent a year building. 48 hours later, the CTO sent an email. The message was 3 sentences long. It said, "This works. This actually works." How much? James read that email 112 times. That email is still on his phone today, not as a screenshot, but the actual message thread. He reads it sometimes when he needs to remember what it felt like to build something that solved a real problem for real people. Veridata became his first paying customer in month 11, at $4,000 monthly. From there came a second customer, and then 3 more. By month 18, he was generating $30,000 in monthly recurring revenue. He was 23 years old. He had not slept more than 5 consecutive hours in over a year. He had never planned to take outside money. The company was growing organically, was already profitable, and he was building something real without owing anyone a single thing. Then, one evening in a coffee shop in San Francisco, someone introduced him to an investor named David Chen. David listened to James talk about the company for 53 minutes, without interrupting, without pitching, without selling anything back. When James finished, David said, "This is real. You've built something real, and you're going to need help scaling it. I want to help you scale it. Will you let me?" James said yes. David Chen's offer was straightforward. Invest $500,000 in exchange for a 15% stake in the company. At the current revenue run rate, That valued the company at approximately $3.3 million. James's ownership would dilute from 100% to 85%, but he'd have capital to hire engineers, buy better infrastructure, and accelerate growth across the entire operation. The meeting where they discussed terms lasted 3 hours. David brought his lawyer. James did not. Instead, he asked his roommate, who was studying business, to read the investment agreement. His roommate said it looked standard. The agreement contained 2 unusual elements. The first was a liquidation preference, which meant that if the company was ever sold or failed completely, David's investment would be paid back before James received anything. That seemed reasonable, because David was taking a real financial risk. The second element was harder to parse through. It was called a conversion ratio on a future round. The language stated that if the company raised more money later, David's shares could convert at different ratios depending on the valuation of that subsequent round. David's lawyer explained this as price protection, meaning if James raised the next round at a lower valuation, David's shares would automatically increase to protect his investment. James believed that was fair. What James did not understand, and what David's lawyer did not explain in clear terms, was that this conversion ratio could work the opposite direction as well. If a future round valued the company higher, David's ratio might adjust downward, but in a way that ultimately benefited David's overall stake relative to James's. The structure was complex and intentionally buried in legal language and cross-references. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one. And if this story is hitting close to home, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what's coming next. The $500,000 arrived 3 weeks later. James hired 2 engineers. He bought more servers and improved the infrastructure. He was no longer alone in the apartment building this thing. Within the first month of David being an investor, David suggested that James should incorporate a separate legal entity for the company's operations, an LLC, rather than a C corporation. David said this was better for tax planning. James did this. David's lawyer handled all the paperwork and legal filings. What James did not realize at the time was that this restructuring, combined with the specific terms of the investment agreement, had created a complex ownership situation where dilution in future rounds would affect James more severely than it would affect David. Over the next year, James was too busy building to read the details of the legal structures. The company was growing rapidly. Revenue doubled. He hired more people and expanded the office space. David introduced him to other investors and kept saying James was going to be huge. But David also kept saying something else. You're going to need more capital. Series A will be maybe 2 million. We'll need to bring in other investors. That's going to dilute you. That's normal. Everyone gets diluted. Everyone gets diluted. James accepted this as truth and stopped questioning it further. Series A happened 18 months after the initial investment. The company was now valued at $12 million. James's stake had diluted to 58%. That meant he was still the majority owner, and it felt like a victory. David led the round. He brought in 2 other institutional investors. The new valuation represented growth from $3.3 million to $12 million. James had grown the valuation nearly 4 times over. He did not ask David why his dilution was steeper than David's dilution. He did not ask a lawyer to review the new cap table in detail. He was too busy running the company, managing the growing team, and handling the work of scaling an infrastructure platform. Series B happened 18 months after Series A. The company was now worth $45 million. Revenue was $8 million annually. The company was genuinely real and productive. James's team had grown to 42 people across engineering, sales, and operations. David led Series B as well, bringing in a new investor, a venture fund called Cortland Partners. The new round was $6 million at a $45 million valuation. The straightforward math suggested 6 million into 45 million meant approximately 13% dilution across the cap table. James expected his stake to drop from 58% to somewhere around 50%. That seemed reasonable and proportional to the amount of capital being raised. When the Series B paperwork closed, James looked at the new cap table. His stake was 41%, not 50%. 41%. He did the math 3 times. Each calculation produced the same result. In Series A, his stake had diluted 17 percentage points. In Series B, his stake had diluted another 17 percentage points, despite the Series B round being significantly smaller in capital terms. That made no mathematical sense. He called David immediately. "The cap table doesn't look right," James said. David's response was calm. "This is normal. You've raised more money. You're diluted. Everyone on the cap table gets diluted. This is how venture capital works." "But the math doesn't match the investment size," James said. "The numbers don't track. Something is wrong with how this was calculated." David said, "Let me have our lawyer call you." "But James, this is standard. You're overthinking it." The lawyer called the next day and spent 45 minutes explaining conversion ratios, liquidation preferences, anti-dilution mechanisms, and equity grants to employees that weren't vesting yet but were reserving ownership for the future. It was dense. It was in legal language. It was complex enough that James lost confidence in his own ability to understand it. By the time he hung up, his head was spinning. A month later, James hired his own lawyer, a startup attorney named Rachel, who had reviewed hundreds of venture deals over her career. He sent her the complete Series A and Series B documentation. Rachel called back 2 days later. "I need you to understand something," Rachel said. "The way these documents are structured, you're going to get progressively more diluted with every round. The liquidation preference plus the conversion ratio plus the anti-dilution clause, they're all stacked against you. It's not aggressive enough to be illegal, but it's built to work against you. The structures compound with each round." "What do you mean, stacked against me?" James asked. "Your stake is going to keep shrinking faster than the math suggests it should, with every round of funding," Rachel said. "And David Chen, he brought both of these documents to you. His lawyer wrote them. This isn't accidental." James was quiet. "Did he tell you he was structuring it this way?" Rachel asked. "No," James said. "Do you want to know what his stake looks like on the current cap table?" Rachel asked. "Yeah," James said. 28%, Rachel said. "Despite investing less capital than you put in from revenue, he owns 28%. You own 41%. By Series C, if this pattern continues, he'll be the largest shareholder and you'll be around 15%. James did not respond immediately. Rachel continued. "The question is whether he engineered this on purpose or whether his lawyers just wrote aggressive terms and he didn't think it through." James knew the answer. He knew because he'd been in business meetings with David for 2 years. David was meticulous. David did nothing without thinking it through completely. "He did it on purpose," James said. Over the next week, James read every investment document in chronological order. Rachel helped him translate the legal language into actual implications. What emerged was a systematic structure designed to progressively transfer ownership to David and other investors, while keeping James as the public founder and CEO. The Series A conversion ratio had been written to allow David's shares to increase if future valuations went higher, but James's shares to increase more slowly in comparison. It was hidden in subsection 4C of the investment agreement, in a paragraph that began with 18 words of preamble, before stating the actual conversion ratio. The Series B anti-dilution clause had been written to protect David's ownership percentage if James later raised capital at a lower price. However, it had also been structured so that the protection kicked in at a lower threshold for David than for other investors. It saved David from massive dilution if the company ever needed a down round. Together, these mechanisms had already transferred 5 percentage points of ownership from James to the investors. Series C hadn't even happened yet. Rachel laid it out on a spreadsheet she created. She modeled what would happen if James raised Series C at the current trajectory and growth rate. At Series C, James would own 17%. David would own 36%. Combined with the other investors, David and his allies would control the company. At 36%, David could control the board. He could control major decisions. He could fire James if he decided to do that. "Here's the thing," Rachel said. "He owns 3 times as much as you do. He engineered this so that you would do all the work, and he would own it." "Why would he do this?" James asked. "Because he wants to own the company," Rachel said. "But he wants you to be the founder, because founders are valuable. Your name sells. Your story sells. Your expertise makes the product real. But he wants to own it. He wants the company to work, and he wants to own it while you run it." James looked at the spreadsheet. He thought about every conversation with David, the way David had listened, the way David had called him "my friend," the way David had said he wanted to help him scale. None of that had been false. David had helped him scale. The company was bigger and more valuable because of David's network, his reputation, his capital introductions. But David had also been systematically, deliberately transferring ownership to himself, while James built the company every single day. The two things were both true simultaneously. "Can we stop Series C?" James asked. "You could try," Rachel said, "but the company needs the capital to stay competitive. You can't scale without it. And if you refuse Series C, David and the other investors can force it anyway. They have enough votes. Series C will happen regardless of what you want." James sat in Rachel's office for a long time without speaking. Outside the window, San Francisco traffic moved endlessly. James called David 3 days after his meeting with Rachel. "I've read all the documents," James said. "I know what you did." There was a pause on the line. "What did I do?" David asked. "You structured the ownership to transfer to you," James said. "With every round. By Series C, you're going to own more of this company than I do, and I'm the one who built it. I coded it. I got the first customer. I scaled it. You brought money and a network, and you engineered the documents so that money and network would eventually buy the whole thing." "That's not accurate," David said. But he said it without conviction. "I had a lawyer review the agreements," James said. "It's accurate. The conversion ratios, the anti-dilution clauses, the liquidation preferences, they're all structured to protect you more than me." Another pause. "James," David said, "this is how venture capital works. Investors get protected. Founders get diluted. This happens to every founder." "Not like this," James said. "You wrote the rules so that you would be protected more than I would be. You did this intentionally." David didn't deny it. He said, "You want to be a billionaire, or you want to be poor and pure. Because you can't be both. I helped you get here. Now you're angry." James hung up. That night, he sat with the same spreadsheet Rachel had created. He looked at the Series C projection. James at 17%, David at 36%. He thought about what would happen in Series D and Series E, at the IPO. By the time the company went public, he'd own 11%, maybe less. But there was one thing David couldn't take from him: his name. The company's brand was built on him. He was the founder who had coded the first version in an apartment. He was the one who'd worked nights at a warehouse. He was the one who'd gotten the first customer. Every investor who came into the company was buying into a company with his name attached. Every customer who signed was buying from him. Every employee who joined was working for him. He couldn't own the company, but he could make it known that the company didn't work without him. He could make his presence non-negotiable. 3 months later, James did something that shocked the board. He started giving talks at tech conferences about infrastructure and scaling. He started mentoring other founders who were navigating their own early rounds. He started being public about the problem of equity dilution and unfair investor terms. He didn't name David or the specific mechanics of his situation. He just started talking about the pattern he'd noticed across the entire startup ecosystem. Other founders recognized themselves in his talks. They started reaching out. They started asking him questions about their own cap tables. And James started answering them honestly. By the time Series C closed 6 months later, James was the most visible founder in the infrastructure space. He was the founder everyone wanted to meet. He was the one writing essays about fair equity structures. He was becoming the public face of an entire movement against predatory venture terms. David owned more of the company. But James owned something else: the narrative. And in a startup ecosystem where narrative is everything, narrative was leverage. When the company went public 9 months later, James walked onto the NASDAQ balcony owning 11% of a $4.7 billion company. He didn't ring the bell, but he didn't need to. Everyone knew who had built it. What James did after that moment is a different story. He used his 11% ownership stake to establish a fund that invests in early-stage founders, not to compete with David, but to protect other founders from becoming like him, dependent on someone else's goodwill and someone else's legal structures. He became every venture lawyer's worst enemy. He started publishing the exact terms that venture investors were offering to founders. He started naming the patterns. He made it harder for investors to hide aggressive dilution in legal language and cross-reference documents. David Chen's next 3 fund pitches faced questions he'd never faced before. Founders started asking about his investment agreements. They started asking why his terms were structured the way they were. A few of them said no. By the time David tried to raise his next fund, other investors had started noticing the pattern as well. The question James learned to ask, and the question we want you to think about, is this: what happens when the person who helped you build something is more interested in owning it than in you succeeding? Next week, we're telling the story of a founder who asked a different question. What happens when you realize the partnership was never about partnership at all? Smash that like button and subscribe. New stories dropping regularly